Maybe we're just the most welcoming group to new couples that don't know to put their picture on yet. But next week we're on it. Group 1, we're on it next week, 100%. All right, well, not long after my wife and I were married, we had saved up and we took a trip to Europe. We were in Athens, Greece, and we scheduled a flight to the island of Santorini. We were excited to go. So we get all the way over to the airport in Athens. As we walk in the airport, I look off to the side and I see this really long line, like 4 people wide, stretching as long as I could see. I remember turning to my wife and saying, "Oh, those suckers. Sure, I'm glad I don't have to wait in that line," which is something you should never say in an airport, because if you see a long line, you're probably going to be standing in that thing pretty soon. But I blissfully walked right past the line. We walked up to the counter, looked at the board, and we see our flight, like every other flight on the board, with that dreaded word delayed on it. So I asked the agent behind the counter, I said, "What's going on?" And she says, "Well, the airline just went on strike." I was like, "Oh man, what am I supposed to do?" And she said, "Well, don't worry. They're just going to be on strike for an hour or two. So you go ahead and you wait in, you guessed it, that big long line over there." Now, I'm no expert in European labor relationships. I don't know what a 1 to 2 hour strike accomplishes. That's a long lunch at that point. But I'm immediately skeptical. So we get in this line. I don't know where it's going. Maybe it's going all the way to Santorini. I don't know. I can't tell. But we're in this line for like an hour. We don't move an inch. So I said, forget this. We get out of line, go downstairs, catch a taxi all the way back to Athens, head down to the harbor, get a ferry. The fast ferry is all booked. So we get on the slow ferry, which I think was powered by like 2 old guys in the back with some paddles, because we weren't going very fast. Took us the entire day to get there. We get to the island at like midnight. It's completely dark. We can't find our hotel. Finally get there, collapsed, exhausted at the end of a very busy day. And the strike, by the way, lasted 4 days. I don't know what the people waiting in line at the airport did, but that Greek Airlines, in one way or another, left us all stranded. Now, our topic tonight is faithfulness. If you look up that word in the dictionary, it would say something about remaining loyal, being steadfast, constant, dedicated, true to doing what you say you're going to do. The Greek Airlines did not meet that definition. They were not faithful. Why? Because they didn't do what they said they were going to do. They weren't faithful and steadfast in their job of flying people to Santorini. And in fact, if I ever go to Santorini again, I'm taking a different airline. Because faithfulness, it's that important. If you're going to rely on something, if you're going to trust in something, faithfulness is an essential trait. And if you want to live a life effective for God, you want to remain faithful to Him, faithful to serve Him, you're going to have to do that in whatever role He gives you in life. And if you want to have an effective marriage, you're going to have to learn faithfulness with your spouse. For a husband and a wife committed to building a marriage that's pleasing to God, it's imperative that you have a firm understanding of faithfulness. You got to understand what it is, you got to understand how to build it in your marriage, and you got to understand how you can sustain it for the long haul. And that's what we're going to dive into tonight. So to see this, why don't you go ahead and turn with me to our passage tonight. Turn to Matthew 25, verses 19 through 21. Classic passage of Jesus on the topic of faithfulness. This passage, Matthew 25, the parable of the talents, which I'm sure you know well. What we're going to do is we're going to look at this passage. We're going to see what Jesus said about faithfulness. And then we're going to look at his life and see how he lived that out. And then finally, we'll see what truths we can then apply in our marriages. So with that as background, let's go ahead and let's jump into our passage. Matthew 25. Let's actually rewind a few verses. Let's pick it up in verse 14. Matthew 25, we'll start in verse 14. It says, "For it will be like a man going on a journey, who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, each according to his ability. And then he went away. And he who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. And so also he who had the 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money." There's verse 19. "So now, after a long time, the master of those servants, he came and he settled accounts with them. And he who had received the most, received the 5 talents, came forward, and he brought 5 talents more. He said, 'Master, check it out. You delivered to me 5 talents. Guess what? I made 5 talents more.' And the master responded to him by saying, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. Look at those words again in verse 21. Well done, good and faithful servant. Faithful servant, two words so often connected in Scripture. Look at Matthew 24:45. I put it on the screen. It says, who then is the faithful and wise servant whom his master has set over his household? Or look at Colossians 1:7. Just as you learned from Epaphras, our beloved fellow servant, he is a faithful minister of Christ on your behalf. Or Hebrews 3:5. It says, now Moses was faithful in all God's house as what? As a servant. You want to be faithful at something? It's pretty clear you have to be ready to be a servant. Now, Jesus was perfectly faithful to God in his entire life. He gave us the example of faithfully always doing what God asked by being a servant. You look at his life, his days were full of serving others, ministering to their needs, healing their diseases, feeding their hunger. And just before he died, Jesus gave us one of the ultimate examples of servanthood by taking off his outer garments, wrapping a towel around his waist as a servant would do, and washing his disciples' feet. Jesus Christ, our perfect example of faithfulness, spent his life serving. If you want to be faithful to God in your lives, you've got to do the same. You have to be willing to serve. In all areas of life, but particularly important for our topic tonight, you need to be a servant in your marriages. You want to be a faithful husband, you want to be a faithful wife, you've got to be ready and willing to serve. Point number 1 on your outline, you need to faithfully serve your spouse. Faithfully serve your spouse. Your mindset in your marriage needs to be, I am here to serve. I'm here to meet my spouse's needs, to serve them, to seek their benefit, and to seek their welfare. That's how you build a faithful marriage. That means you need to ask yourself today, this week, how can I be a blessing to my wife? Or how can I be a blessing to my husband? How can I set my own needs aside, my own interests, and do something for them and to meet their needs? And you got to be committed to this, because this isn't something that comes naturally. Not after 20 plus years of marriage. Not when those early lovey-dovey years of marriage are all behind us. Not when you get set in your ways. And you want, Burger King used to tell us, you want to have it your way. And then God comes along and says, well, no, forget about your way. You need to set that aside. You need to serve your spouse. That's why God made it so clear, even in the roles that he gave husbands and wives. He gave us complementary roles so we can serve one another just like he designed. Think about Ephesians 5. What does it call us to do? Wives, submit to your husbands. Lay aside what you want to do and serve and be faithful and submit to his leadership. And husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church, and he gave himself up for her. You gotta be ready to sacrifice for her, lay down your life for her, serving her in true faithfulness. You see, when both of you are faithful to fulfill your roles, serving one another, that is when your marriage really works well. So my challenge for each of you tonight is if you want to build faithfulness in your marriage, you've got to be intentional in this. Each week, you should be picking something you can do specifically for the benefit of your husband or your wife. Something you don't get the benefit of. You do it to serve them. Why? Because you love them, and you want to be faithful to the role that God called you to. If you just did this, if you just did one thing for your spouse once a week for a full year, after a year, you'd have 52 things that you've done specifically to serve and for the benefit of your spouse. So you do that for a year, and then you come back here and you tell me that your marriage isn't stronger. You tell me your walk with God isn't close. You got to be intentional in serving your spouse. Well, how do I do that? I don't even know how to do that. Well, let me give you some ideas. Here's some ideas that you can faithfully serve your spouse. First, when a need arises in your marriage, whatever it is, you be the first to offer to meet that need. Like when my wife and I, we sit down on the couch at the end of a long day. We're tired, we're exhausted, and we just sit down on the couch and we want to relax. And as soon as we sit on the couch, the dog starts scratching at the door. All right, and I'm so tempted to pretend that I can't hear that infernal scratching. And then my wife gets up to let the dog out, and I was like, oh, was that the dog pretending like I can't hear that scratching that was going on? No, I need to be the one to get up. I need to be the one to let the dog go. Why? Because I love my wife. And I want to serve her. And don't tell me after the lesson to get a dog door, because my dog's like 10 pounds. It would last like 2 minutes in the great outdoors. It'd be like an amuse-bouche to a coyote out there. So I need to be the one to get up and let the dog out. Or when my son's coach, who insists on scheduling practice at the least convenient time and place possible. We got practice at it's like 4 a.m. in Barstow. And I can feel God's call. Hey, you be the one to go and drop them off. Or you be the one to go pick them up. I mean, what a blessing you can be to your spouse when you jump at the chance to meet the need that arises. And you do it, why? To serve your spouse. Or something else. Maybe you could just do something that your spouse normally does. Maybe they're always cleaning the bathrooms or doing the laundry each week. Maybe you can do it one week. Why? No reason. Other than you just want to be the faithful servant that God called you to be. Or even just surprise and delight in them. Bring them flowers, get them a gift. You got date night planned, pick the restaurant that they like, not the one that you like. Jesus Christ, our faithfulness example, was a faithful servant, and he lived his life serving others. And his call to us is to do the same. And God's given each of you the gift of a spouse, a husband or a wife who's sitting right next to you here tonight. And you got to be a faithful steward of the gift that God has given you. And you got to use that gift as God intended, and you do that by faithfully serving your spouse. But let's go back to our passage in Matthew 25. Because not only were those that were given the 5 and the 2 talents faithful at serving their master, they were also pretty effective at it. Look at verse 20. It says, he who had received the 5 talents came forward, and he brought 5 talents more. The master, you delivered me 5, I've doubled it. I've made 5 talents more. And later you'll see the one that had the 2 talents did the same. The faithful servants doubled their profits. That's not easy to do. But they worked hard at it, and they kept their focus on their task by being faithful in it, weren't distracted by other things that could come and steal their attention. They had focus, they had discipline, they prioritized what the master asked them to do, and they were faithful in their task, and they doubled their profits. And that's our call as well. If we want to be faithful in our lives, we've got to prioritize God. And we've got to prioritize the work that God gave us to do. That means we need to be making practical decisions in our life to choose God over the other stuff in our lives. That's how Christ lived. What was he always saying to his disciples? I have come to do the work of my Father. And nothing got in the way of that. And he was faithful to preach the gospel, to do God's work his entire life. Jesus always found a way to do exactly what it was that the Father was asking him to do because that was his priority. And you want to build that faithfulness to God in your life, you've got to make him the priority over everything, having no other competing interest out there. You want to build faithfulness in your marriage? You've got to apply these same principles, but in the context of your marriage. Because your spouse, catch this, is the most important human relationship that you have. You understand that? Your spouse is the most important human earthly relationship that you have. You are called to be one with your spouse, with your husband, with your wife that is different than in any other relationship that you have. So you have got to make your husband, your wife, the priority earthly relationship. You want to build faithfulness in your marriage? Point number 2 on your outline. You need to faithfully prioritize your spouse. Making tangible decisions, making practical decisions each and every day to choose your spouse over whatever else it is that you've got going on in your life. Choosing, prioritizing your spouse. And of course, you do it out of faithfulness to God. He's the one you're ultimately faithful to. But he's called you to leave your father, to leave your mother, to hold fast to your husband, to your wife. He's called you to love your spouse, sacrifice for your spouse, to serve your spouse. And you're only going to be able to do that effectively if you make them the priority over all other relationships that you have. And this has got to be an active process. You've got to actively choose to prioritize your spouse. Because if you don't make that active effort, it's not going to happen. My wife and I encountered this very early in our marriage, back when we turned 30 years old, within a year of each other. And for my birthday, my wife gave me a really nice surprise birthday. Really nice party. And then for her birthday, I took her on a really nice weekend trip to New York City. And we were talking a few months later, still getting to know each other, and we said to each other, well, what do you like to do for birthdays? And my wife said, oh, I love surprise parties. And I said, oh, I love getting away for weekend trips. And we thought, oops. We just imposed what we wanted onto our spouse's birthday. We made ourselves the priority over our spouse. And we didn't even have to think about it. It came naturally. That's why you got to work hard to keep your spouse the priority. Work hard to prioritize your spouse. Well, how do I do that? Well, let me give you 3 ways that you can do this. 3 ways that you can faithfully prioritize your spouse. I'll put it on the screen. The first way you can prioritize your spouse is with your time. Prioritize your spouse with your time. You've got a hobby, you've got an interest, fantastic. Does your spouse, does your husband, does your wife know that they are more important to you than that hobby? I don't know. How would I know? You need to make sure that there are times when you are choosing to spend time with your spouse over that hobby. There needs to be times that you're, whatever it is, skipping the bike ride, or skipping the round of golf, or skipping the shopping trip, whatever it is, and you're doing something with your spouse instead, showing your spouse that they are more important than those things. Or how about the phone? That can be a priority use of our time. There ought to be times when you're going to resolve, you're going to set that thing down and say, no, I'm not going to look at this right now because I am talking to my husband. I am talking to my wife. Or even taking the time just to listen when they've had a hard day and they just want to share with you. You should always have time for that. You need to prioritize your spouse with your time. Secondly, you can prioritize your spouse with your possessions. With your possessions, and this is such a perfect opportunity because money is finite, but so often our desires for things are infinite. So what are you going to do? You're going to have to make a choice. Are we going to spend money on this, or are we going to spend money on that? And you might have noticed that you and your spouse often tend to want to spend money in different ways. We realized that early in our marriage. We went to buy a couch for the first time. I realized, my wife and I, we were going about this couch purchase completely differently. Because I could buy a couch blindfolded. Right? All I need to do is sit down in the thing. As long as it's comfortable, I'm good. And she could buy a couch without ever sitting in it. She just wants it to look nice. So what kind of couch are we going to buy? Are we going to buy the one that looks nice? Or are we going to buy the comfortable one with the big cushion and the recliner chair that comes out and the cup holder? Which one are we going to buy? These are opportunities to prioritize your spouse with your possessions, with what you choose to buy. Prioritizing their wishes, their desires over yours. There's a third way you can prioritize your spouse, and that is in your relationships. In your relationships. Because your spouse is the priority earthly relationship, you need to prioritize them. It's not your kids. You realize that, right? Your kids are not the priority relationship. Your teen's not your BFF. It's not your closest relationship. Because your relationship with your kids is in a large part a temporary relationship. They're arrows to be shot out into the world to go make their own way. But your spouse is a life partner given to you by God until death do us part. So you should have clear ways in your marriage, in your family, that you are prioritizing your spouse over your kids. It means you're regularly going on date nights, leaving the kids at home. That means you should talk to your husband or you should talk to your wife more than you talk to your kids. You should text your husband or your wife more than you text your kids. You should spend more time with your husband or wife than you spend with your kids. Your kids are not the priority relationship. Your extended family is not the priority relationship. So many marriages have been ruined by over-involved family members. Your friends are not the priority relationship. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have Christian friends. You should have them. They're important. They're a good thing. But the spouse that is always choosing to spend time with their friends, choosing to go on trips with their friends at the expense of the time with their spouses, is not in a healthy marriage. You got to faithfully prioritize your spouse, your time, with your possessions, your relationships. It takes energy. It takes effort. You got to make those tough decisions to keep your spouse where they belong as the priority earthly relationship that you have. Well, let's go back to our passage. One final thing. Go back to Matthew 25. Look at verse 19. Matthew 25:19 starts by saying, after a long time. Long time. I don't know how long it's been, but it's been some time. The master of the servants came and settled accounts with them. And the faithful servants proved themselves faithful. Why? Because they kept at their work until the master returned. They kept on doing the work of the master, and they endured, and they were ready when he came back. Because the faithful servant isn't just faithful for a day, or for a week, or for a month. The faithful servant is faithful for his entire life until God calls him home. Christ was perfectly faithful to God for 33 years on earth, doing all the work that God gave him to do, never turning aside, not even at the prospect of being beaten, whipped, nailed to a cross. He resolved and he said, not my will, but your will be done. And he faithfully endured until the end. And you see, we need this kind of endurance. We need this kind of commitment in our marriage, saying we're in this thing 100%. Come what may, we're committed, we're faithful until death do us part. And we're going to endure. We're in this for the long haul. Point number 3 on your outline, you need to faithfully endure with your spouse. Whatever life throws at you, endure. And that's not always easy to do. Serve your spouse, prioritize them over everything else, and to do this for the rest of your life, never tiring, never giving up, always enduring, that's hard. And yeah, it's easy to start marriage and say all the right things. I love you, I'm committed to you. Even non-Christian marriages start that way. But they don't last because they're not really committed. Sure, they start by saying, I love you, I'll move mountains for you, and then a couple years goes by, and your spouse asks you to pick up a gallon of milk on the way home from work, and you're like, oh, that's too much. And marriages fail because they were never really all that committed in the first place. And they wake up 20 years later and they haven't been doing the work of faithfulness in their marriages. They have no foundation, and couples, they give up. That's not a Christian marriage. It's not a faithful marriage. No, a faithful marriage is one that lasts. A faithful marriage is one that is stronger at year 20 or year 30 or year 40 than when it began. A faithful marriage, it endures. But what does that take? How do you faithfully endure with your spouse and do it for the long haul? What do you need to endure and do it well? Well, I've got 3 words to help you here. 3 words. I got you 3 R words. These are like Ryan's R's of faithfulness, I guess. Starting with the first one, the first thing you need to faithfully endure with your spouse is you need resolve. You've got to have resolve. Because being faithful is a decision. You decide to be faithful. Because there's going to be days in your marriage when you don't feel like it. When you're tired, when your spouse is annoying you, and an opportunity to prioritize your spouse comes up and you may not feel like it that day. That's why every day you need a resolve to make a decision to choose your spouse. That means you have to be praying about this every single day. You got a prayer list? Great. You know what should be on your prayer list every day? Your marriage. You know who should be on your prayer list every single day? Your spouse. Every day you ought to be praying. Praying for your marriage, praying for opportunities for you to be faithful in your marriage, for you to serve your spouse, for you to prioritize your spouse. Praying for a resolve to be faithful in that even when you don't feel like it. It's that important. Marriage is a huge gift of God that he's given you. The servants in the parable were entrusted with a lot. Just a single talent was worth 15 to 20 years of wages. A single talent was worth up to $2 million. And it's clear in the parable that the master expected those servants to use what he gave them wisely. And God's entrusted you with a marriage, with a spouse. He entrusts you with a lot, and God expects you to use that gift appropriately and you to use that gift wisely. Every day, you've got to face it with the resolve to use that gift wisely and be the kind of faithful husband or wife that God called you to be. Got to have resolve. But there's a second trait that's essential for having faithful endurance in marriage, and that is realism. Realism, because a faithful marriage, an enduring marriage, is a realistic marriage. And it starts with the realization, newsflash here, I know, your spouse, not perfect. Right? No elbow nudging here, please. Your spouse is not perfect. The more you understand that, the more you're going to have the right expectations in your marriage, and the more prepared you're going to be to fulfill your roles in marriage. It's like this summer, my wife and I were down at the beach doing the True North beach night drop-off. So we drop off my son, and my wife says to me, well, hey, let's go get some ice cream. And I said, yes, now we're talking. Let's go get some ice cream. And she had the perfect ice cream spot picked out. She said, I know this new restaurant. We're going to go get some ice cream there. So off we go. We get some ice cream. I'm excited about it. We sit down. I start eating it. And then I turned to her and I said, you know what? So I took a couple bites. This new ice cream place, not all that great. Took a couple more bites. And I said, you know what, honey? In fact, this ice cream, it tastes a little funny. And that's when she tells me, this place we went to, this ice cream shop, was one of those gluten-free, sugar-free, dairy-free, taste-free, deliciousness-free ice cream substitute place. I went in expecting ice cream. I came out with, I don't know what I came out with, but it wasn't ice cream. I had the wrong expectations, and so I was disappointed. You got to have realistic expectations in your marriage so you are not disappointed. Your spouse is not perfect. Everything in your marriage is not going to be perfect all the time. Your spouse is never going to make you perfectly happy. Only God does that. Oh, your spouse is a good thing. It's a good gift from God, but in a fallen world, people aren't perfect, and your spouse isn't perfect. But you see, so often in marriage, we're tempted to think that, oh, if only my husband, if only my wife were only like this, then things would be good. Oh, if they only planned date nights like that. Or if our intimacy was only like this. If my spouse only planned great vacations like that family. If my spouse only knew how to be romantic like that couple, then things would be great in our marriage. Or even more, we're tempted to use the imperfections of our spouse as reasons for us not to fulfill and be faithful in our own roles. Well, if he's going to lead that way, well, I'm not submitting. And if she's going to say those kind of things about me, well, I'm not going to sacrifice for her. No, we're faithful to our roles no matter the imperfections of our spouse. Be realistic. Yes, your spouse is not perfect, but your spouse is still a gift of God to you that he's designed exactly for you, and you can appreciate them for that. And you can be faithful to fulfill your role even when your spouse isn't perfect. That's a key to faithful endurance in your marriage. But I got a final R for you. I promise you 3. The third R is reward. Because as verse 19 says, the master of the servants is going to come and he's going to settle accounts with them. And the servants are going to have to give an accounting for what they did with their gifts. And one day you are going to have to stand before God. And God's going to say to you, I gave you a great gift. I gave you a marriage. I gave you a spouse. Were you faithful with that gift? And if you used that gift well, if you did all that we were talking about tonight, and you served your spouse, and you prioritized your spouse, through all the trials and all the difficulties of life, then you're going to be in verse 21, and the master is going to say to you, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a little, I will set you over much. Come, enter into the joy of your master. Come and receive your reward. And we need the motivation now that the reward that we're going to get then is going to be worth whatever sacrifice we make in our lives and in our marriages. And we faithfully endure in our marriage. With the resolve to be a faithful spouse, even when we don't feel like it. With the realism that even though our spouse is imperfect, it's still a good gift of God to us. And a focus on our reward of hearing that well done, good and faithful servant. These are reminders that can help us faithfully endure in our marriage. Well, over 20 years later, this past summer, I took my family back to Europe. My son was graduating high school, so we saved up, and we took a special trip. We didn't go to Greece, but I did rent a car in England. So I drove on the left. And actually, it's not as hard as it sounds. Because I was at the rental car place, and the guy gave me some pretty good advice. He says, look, you're going to be driving on the other side of the road, but the wheel's also on the other side of the car. So you, as a driver, should still be somewhere like in the middle of the road. That if you ever find yourself behind the wheel hugging the curb, there's probably a problem. I'm like, oh, that was strangely useful advice. But what was hard, I did run into some trouble. What was hard were those stinking roundabouts in England. If you're sitting there thinking, well, what's hard about a roundabout? Well, nothing's hard about a roundabout. A normal one, you get in, you get off. But when it's one of those big ones and there's like 7 lanes and 12 exits, I had never any idea what lane I was supposed to be in. And let's just say there was a lot of honking in the roundabouts of England about 2.5, 3 months ago. But one thing really helped. I never went anywhere without Google Maps on. Because even if I didn't know where to go, there was something that Google Maps knew. And all I needed to do was follow its directions. All I needed to do was follow that little blue line. And it kept me safely on the left side of the road, got me through the roundabouts, and helped me faithfully get to where I needed to go. There's so many difficulties in marriage. So many detours that can keep us from building the kind of faithfulness that we need. There's so many ways that we can get off track in marriage. But there is someone that knows the right way to go. And he's got all the directions that we need. And he can get us through faithfully the roundabouts of the married life and bring us safely home. We just got to commit to following his directions. And we do that by faithfully serving our spouse, doing things not for our benefit, but for their benefit. And we do that by faithfully prioritizing your spouse, making sure that no other earthly relationship gets in front of our husband or our wife. We do that by faithfully enduring with our spouse. The hope and the trust that God's going to faithfully reward those who serve him. Those are directions to faithfulness in your marriage. Let's pray. God, we thank you that you are a perfectly faithful God. And you came to earth to live a perfectly faithful life, to give us the example of how to live. And you did it perfectly for us. And you showed us how to serve, and you showed us how to properly prioritize. And I just pray right now that we can take these truths from your word, truths from your life, of how to be faithful to you, and we can take them and we can ingest them, and then we can bring them into our marriage and learn through practice and hard work how we can be faithful, be the faithful husband leading our marriage that you called us to be the faithful wife, supporting, submitting, loving our husbands, and you can help that to do it well so that our marriage grows as we grow closer to each other, we grow closer to you. That is a faithful marriage. And I just pray for this discussion time right now that you may bless it, and you may just help everyone here have a good discussion and a better understanding after tonight of how we can be faithful in the roles you've given us. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.